Hello and welcome to the penultimate episode of our Norway 80th anniversary and the battles around Narvik. We've got quite a long episode for you today, but things are finally going to kick off around Narvik. But as always, I'm going to sort of recap as to where we are and also mention France. So the Battle of France is going really, really badly for the Allies. German columns have cut through the British and French lines. They've kicked them out of Western Belgium and are forcing them towards the coast. And the British are falling back towards Dunkirk. The Germans have also cut off Boulogne, Calais, and by the time that we're about 30th of May, what we're looking at, sort of period we're looking at, they've encircled the beaches as well, and the army has carried out the infamous halt order to allow the Luftwaffe to harass any escape attempts. It's looking like the Battle of France is pretty much over, although the French are still attempting to fall back and defend Paris. But the big question is, how long will they fight for? And will it be over soon? The next big question is, if France falls, will the Wehrmacht turn towards Britain? So these are all things that are being borne in mind by Auchinleck and the commanders up in Norway, as well as London. This said, the campaign in the north of Norway is going pretty well. The German mountain divisions and sailors are falling back under continued assault from the 6th and 7th Norwegian divisions, whilst the Polish and French were pushing up to Narvik from the south. Despite Luftwaffe's superiority, Dietl is looking at complete collapse unless the German troops pushing up from Trondheim can smash through the British forces holding them back at Bodo and march to his relief. By the 24th of May, Admiral the Earl of Cork has spoken to the French commander Bethua and told him that there would be an evacuation. Bethua takes himself away for half an hour, comes back, and he says, well, it's impossible for my men and the Polish to evacuate whilst we have contact with the enemy. The Earl of Cork says that he completely understands that. They both agree that the Allies need to have a victory for morale reasons, but they need to hurry up and get on with it and either force the Germans to surrender or intern in Sweden, and they need to do it PDQ, which means Narvik is pretty much going to be the final stand.
Indeed. So the date of the attack is set. It's going to be on the 27th of May at midnight. The 13th Demi Brigade of Foreign Legion, with 5 Hotchkiss light tanks and a Norwegian ski battalion, are to attack Oreset on the outskirts of Narvik and German positions on hills that are overlooking the town. In the meantime, there's an Allied force that would cross the fjords in small boats at the base of the Taralsvik Plateau. Now, this French force would then push towards the town, driving the Germans out before allowing the Norwegians to retake the city. Now, the Norwegian 7th Brigade was to push south and sever the railway connection between Narvik and Sweden, and they were supported by French Alpine troops. Now, to do this, they need artillery support. They have guns on the Oljord Peninsula, and the Royal Navy Task Force consisting of the cruiser Cairo and 5 destroyers, which close the area. Air superiority, or at least support. Now, despite the Sea Gladiator biplane fighters operating from HMS Furious, which are pretty much obsolete at this point, there were 18 Hawker Hurricanes of 43 Squadron that had just arrived, and they were, of course, brought over by HMS Glorious. Now, although the Hurricane is a game changer, the pilots are unfamiliar with the area and they get lost often. And when operating over Narvik, they are at the end of their fuel lines. And so they can't operate over there for long before they have to fly back so that they can refuel. Now, they need to evict the Germans from Ankenes and Biesford, as they have gun positions there that support Narvik. Now, we've mentioned this a couple times already, but Alina, what are the Poles up to?
Exciting times. So basically, the Polish 1st Battalion is southeast of Arkens at the moment. They're facing the German positions in Biesford, while the 2nd Battalion is holding the Arkens Ridge on a 5-kilometre long line, whilst the 3rd and 4th Battalions were in reserve. So they had to. What I mean, they had to take Biesford to cut off any German retreat. And Arkens could be cut off and left, basically would leave the Germans stranded on the peninsula. The French supply the Poles with 2 light tanks for support, which is shock, horror, horror. The Poles actually get some weapons. Exciting times. In their offensive, where the British would then provide air support and naval signalmen who could coordinate artillery support with the cruiser Southampton. But the boatswain, which is carrying the signalling equipment, slipped climbing one of the steep hills and it broke the equipment, which caused battery acid to spill basically all over it. Instead, they tried to signal with Cephomore with 2 towels, and, well, as we can guess, this did not go very well. The Poles would, however, be supported by a French artillery force and half a battery of British Hausers, covering the 1st and 2nd battalions respectively. So there is something positive coming out of this. The Norwegians were told that the plan had been delayed for 24 hours because the airfield for the Hurricanes was not quite ready just yet. General Fleischer sat at the rendezvous point awaiting 0 hour, and more or less like Chris, who sits on a date, no one turned up. So he's all on his Larry. Which brings us to the engagement, Chris, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this is why I often sat on my own. On the 27th of May at 11:40, so the day after the Norwegians turned up, the naval force, 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers, begin the heaviest bombardment of the campaign. It was so intense that the civilian population were terrified. They fled to their basements to avoid fiery death, and the Germans were they hid as well. I'm not going to lie. They could have returned fire, but they were worried that if they did start returning fire, the British would notice where their firing positions were and start firing back at them. So they just tried to wait it out for as long as possible, which is quite difficult when you've got like 12-inch shells landing amongst you. The guns stopped at midnight, so it's only been a 20-minute bombardment, but it's more than enough. And the French forces land safely, buoyed up with a generous rum ration. They managed to get all the heavy equipment off the boats and deployed whilst the Germans were still under cover. With the bombardment over, the Germans knew that something was coming. You know, you have a heavy artillery bombardment that just stops. It means that you don't shell your own men. As Blackadder said, it's far more sporting to let the Germans do it. But they didn't want to go out and attack because they knew that if they suddenly left their positions and started charging, they too would come under fire. So they decided the best thing to do would be to sit back and wait for the French or the inevitable attack. They also see a white signal flare launched from HMS Cairo.
Yeah, that's my bit now, isn't it? Talking more about the Poles. Back to the Poles again. So, seeing the white flares, the 1st Polish Battalion under Major Koblinski moved towards the village of Biesford, and the 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Deck with the 2 tanks moves towards Nyberg and Arkenns, but one of the tanks hits a mine and is disabled, while the 2nd tank gets stuck in a ditch, which kind of isn't very helpful at this point. Attacking in 2 directions basically runs the risk that should the Germans repel the attack on Biesford, then they had a lifeline to stay in the fight, or at least to get to Sweden. But General Bogusz was gambling in all of this. And by the way, if you want to hear me talk more about General Bogusz, you can listen to our extra content, because this weekend I found his grave in Warsaw. So head to our extra content to hear a little bit more about that. Coming back to this, the 1st Battalion takes a very, very cautious approach, probing for the enemy's positions and updating their positions with their artillery support and calling down fire when they hit resistance. Koblinski's men suffered only a handful of casualties in this advance. So it's a kind of, good things and bad things are happening at the same time. I guess the bonus of this is a low casualty amount. By 2:30 a.m, they were at Hill 643 and had attacked Hill 650. But the German MG-42 nests were dug really deep in and gave a lot of resistance until an artillery barrage dislodged them. By 5:30 a.m, it was all looking good for the 1st Battalion, but it is not for the 2nd so much. They encountered a lot of German traps, fortified machine gun placements, and stiff resistance without the benefit of artillery support. The 2nd Company under Captain Stanchuk encounters a lot of German resistance on what came to be named Fasolka Hill. And I want to know from these guys, do you know what Fasolka means?
No, I meant to look it up.
I did not know there was going to be a quiz today.
Well, I just thought for funsies as I'm going through my notes. Does anyone know what Fasolka means?
Glorious German victory in one word.
I'd like to say it's not that exciting. It means beans.
Oh.
Like baked beans, but not baked beans, but beans. So Beans Hill.
Okay, that makes sense.
There's a lot of gas on that hill.
Oh, there you go. So thought there'd be a little bit of quiz there for you. Anyway, coming back to what's going on. So let me take a step back. So they're encountering a lot of German resistance on Fasolka, so Bean Hill, where the Germans had previously had a position they had used against the Sashkevich Hill from the last episode that we spoke about. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion's 3rd Company encountered no resistance and moved ahead quite quickly, but got separated in the undergrowth and snow, leading to a lot of confusion. I mean, it is kind of easy to get lost in those flurries. I guess that's the right way of saying it, flurries of snow everywhere. This was part of the German plan, and when the 3rd Company got near to Arkenz, they came under heavy artillery fire, and the mortars basically devastated the whole company. The 2nd Company was still fighting on its hill and so could not advance to help these guys that are being heavily bombed. And the Germans then counterattacked, causing heavy casualties in the 3rd Company. So on one hand, we've got, a positive low amount of casualties. On the other flip side, we've got companies and battalions with a lot more casualties on this side. But let's talk about the French. What are the French doing, Zane?
They're doing quite a bit, but it's not going great for them either in this situation. The French tanks had also been knocked out by the terrain, and the German mortars were causing panic in the Norwegian ski platoons, who would be cut off from the French, and only the destroyers and French artillery that were engaging could save the situation. Now, these German guns did not sink any of the vulnerable troop transports, despite sending up a lot of water, and the fire was gaining in intensity. Now, the 2 barges that were carrying the other tanks, they would ground, and so the French would be forced to use steamers to get troops in to the beaches, which was extremely far from ideal in that situation. Now, the French artillery was proving very problematic for the Germans, and so that became their priority target, and they would use railway-mounted 77mm guns, which had been previously hidden in tunnels for their protection, so that they could return fire on the French. Now, after each salvo, the Germans would then return the guns to the tunnels so that any French return fire would fall ineffectively, but the Royal Navy would move in and shell the tunnels that would then force the Germans to cease fire. Now, at 4 a.m., the RAF, they leave the area again so they can refuel, and fog over the airfields means that they cannot take off again. The Luftwaffe then begins their strikes, with HMS Cairo being hit amidship, killing 30 and setting the cruiser on fire. Now, she would withdraw, and General Bethroth, who had been on the deck, would also be withdrawn. German bombers also sank the ammunition boat Priscus, killing all aboard and taking the ammunition with it. Now, the air raids and disruption to the ships would lead to the French holding off on resupplying the beachhead. The German bombers would also attack the French artillery, which gives the Narvik garrison the opportunity to counterattack the French and Norwegian landings effectively. It was almost like pushing the latter into the sea and threatening the French flank. Now, the battle, of course, at this point had swung to German dominance. It was kind of hinted at, but it's not going well for the Poles either, and they have faced a German counterattack with the 2nd Battalion, losing not only a popular officer, Lieutenant Kempney, but also the British boatswain who had broken the signal lamp, who was fighting along with the infantry. Now, the Germans weren't taking prisoners or the wounded, and this had a knock to Polish morale, and the Polish center withdrew, cutting off any support from the British ships. To make it worse, the Luftwaffe began to bomb Polish positions and also withdrawing troops. Now, there would be a Polish counterattack that would see the Bean Hill that Alina was referring to earlier taken, and heavy machine guns emplaced, which would cut off the German push. Now, the whole campaign hung in the balance, because if the French and Poles lost now, then the campaign is over and it ends in disaster. Now, by 6 o'clock, the Luftwaffe withdrew so that they could also refuel, and then the RAF would return to the skies, shooting down 2 Hinkel bombers. The Navy and artillery returned to the fore, including the freshly arrived cruiser Coventry, and suddenly it's all back on again. The French managed to take Hill 457 by 11 a.m., with vicious hand-to-hand fighting, which saw the German sailors holding the hill break and flee through detachments of them holding out in rifle pits or machine gun nests, and it would take several hours to clear them all out. There was also a grenade battle that would ensue around one of the railway tunnels. This was housing German guns, but the French would manage to prevail. Now, the Norwegians also pushed forward and cut the German evacuation route to Sweden, and the Polish would manage to take the cliffs overlooking the village of Nyberg, and by noon, they had already retaken Hill 295. So, what is the German endgame?
Not good at this point. The situation, this is very much a battle of sort of swings and roundabouts. It started in Allied favour, swung to the German favour, and it's all hinging around air support. So at the moment, for the German defenders, the decision is taken to abandon the port of Narvik. It cannot be held, and they know it. So several German troops, quote unquote, commandeer several vessels in the harbour, and they try to sail to the north shore and to Fanganes. They all come under heavy fire, not only from the RAF, but also from the Polish positions on the cliffs. They managed to sink one boat, killing 60. Other German soldiers end up in the fjord and swimming through the frozen water in full kit, which would have been freezing, to go and surrender to the Polish troops on the shoreline. As we've said, the Poles are holding a very dominating position, and they could pour down artillery and mortar rounds on any German easterly retreat if they could get their heavy equipment into position quickly enough. And the German officers in charge at Narvik realized pretty quickly that if they didn't hang around and got out now, they could do so before the Polish could reinforce this position. So they do move it as fast as they can into a full retreat. It's not quite a rout, but it's faster than it probably should have been. They did, however, still hold the Ankenes Peninsula, Fagerenes, and town of Biesfjord. The French have ordered the Poles to attack Biesfjord early in the day, but the telephone call went through to a telephone on Hill 295, which at that point was held by the Germans. They then, when it eventually got to the Poles, they were reluctant in case the Germans counterattacked and caught them out from the rear. So by the time they did attack at 4 p.m., the town had been fully reinforced by all the men who'd fled from Narvik. 7 hours later, the Poles are finally reaching the suburbs of Biesfjord, but they're exhausted. They've been fighting all day. It's not been an easy battle, and so the fighting kind of peters out. At 5 p.m., the Norwegian army march into Narvik. They're the first people to arrive, and it had been decided by the High Command that it would be right and proper for the Norwegians to liberate Narvik from the German invader. They march in and they put up the flags of the British and the Norwegians, not the French and not the Poles, which was quite notable. But that's when the Luftwaffe turn up again, and they retaliate by bombing Narvik. And as there's no anti-aircraft defense, the civilians are all evacuated. The Germans also attempt to bomb the fleet, but missed. They then get intercepted by hurricanes, and they lose 3 bombers, which cause them to stop attacking. The Germans' will to fight is completely over by 5 a.m. the following morning. The Polish entered Biesfjord. Dietl's men were now completely surrounded, and despite holding out in some places, such as Yarkens Peninsula, amongst others, it looks like the campaign in the north is over, as far as Dietl and his men are concerned. 190 of them had been killed on the Arkanis Peninsula, and there are 300 prisoners of war, 100 of which were taken in the first hour. The Allies had suffered around 200 casualties, with the largest being the Norwegians, who had suffered 60. But is the war for Norway going to stop? Have the Allies got their foothold? It all depends how things are going on Bodo.
Yeah, basically Gubbins, who we've spoken about in previous episodes, had withdrawn his forces to Finnid, which is 42 miles east of Bodo, and formed a defensive line with the Irish Guards, which were commanded by a captain, following all of the officers killed on the Chrobra disaster, number 2 and 3 independent companies, which were holding the Suldelt Valley. On the 25th of May, the Germans begin attacking their positions on the east side of the river, And then on the night of the 25th and 26th, the Germans built a temporary bridge over the river and transferred most of their forces across to the West Bank and pressed on there, more or less. Gubbins had received news of France. France has fallen, and that he was to be evacuated as well, and his forward forces begin to withdraw on the 26th at lunchtime under cover of 2 gladiator fighters, quote, who claimed several German aircraft which were destroyed or damaged. The Irish Guards fought a fighting retreat. They burned stores, broke equipment all the way until they were loaded onto a ferry that would cross the fjord, until it broke down and had to be towed. Only one of the company guards was left behind, and they force marched 20 miles across country to a point they could just not be retrieved from. And there was no force stopping the German thrust from Trondheim and from reaching Dietl. So, Allies are in not a great position, are they, Chris?
No, and just to add insult to injury, as we said at the beginning of the episode, they were going to talk about evacuation. On the 31st of May, London announces that the evacuation must begin, and this was passed to King Haakon VI on the 2nd of June and to General Ruger, who, roughly to paraphrase, said, so this is how it ends for Norway, the same way as the Czechs and the Poles. We get just burnt and left. But as we've said, the Allies really don't have much choice for any other action. But you have to come back next week for Operation Alphabet. And more importantly, the whole thing started with the German Navy and it's going to end with the German Navy. And we're going to talk about Operation Juno. So do come back for that on the 9th or 10th of June. And thanks for listening. And as always, any stars, comments, likes, etc. on your chosen platform of choice are always greatly appreciated. Also helps with the algorithm. And if anyone fancies supporting our work, do head over to Patreon. There will be lots of free stuff. But we'll also be talking about that Polish general who I'm not even going to pretend to know how I pronounce his name. I'm really glad Alina got that section. And other stuff in, probably try and squeeze Star Wars in as well. So thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next week.